Okay, thank you very much for having me. I'm going to, as Tomas suggested, I'm going to give you an overview of my PhD research and link it particularly with formal education and what, from hearing your poster presentations in particular, I'll try and link into what's going on in the room as best I can as I go. So the title of my present PhD was Reconnecting Children with Nature, and it was a sociological study of environmental education in Ireland. So it was in the School of Political Science in Sociology in NUI Galway, and I hope it connects quite well into the after workshops as well that we do. So to give a brief overview, I'll go over my research aims and objectives, just to kind of put it into context. The research process, which I think is always good to look at methods, how the data was collected, to give an overview of that. Environmental education, putting it into context as a case for Ireland. And then looking at the disconnection hypothesis that underpins an awful lot of environmental education. I suppose when I say environmental education, I'm giving it a loose term. I know there's a lot of adventure education in the room as well, but from the point of view of the disconnection hypothesis, there's been a lot of talk on how children's contact with the natural environment has changed in recent decades, so looking at that a little bit closer. And concepts of environmental education, the different approaches to environmental education and what that means for the sector overall. And it's also then the role within or status of environmental education throughout primary school curricula in Ireland. My other role at the moment, I'm a consultant with a charity called the Bay Trust in the UK, and I've learned an awful lot from the UK perspective of outdoor learning and the research that's there, and to maybe share some of the evidence that you're already aware of. But again, I hope that it'll contribute to our discussions after. So the research aims and objectives. The first question was to examine the development of environmental education in Ireland and to what extent it is effective or ineffective in connecting children with the natural environment or disconnecting them further. To critically analyse the environmental education and its underlying concepts of education, what educational approaches are within environmental education, what strands exist, concepts of the natural environment, what idea of the natural environment are within programmes, what's being delivered and what's the content, and also the links to sustainable development, which is a very complex term. There's various definitions and interpretations of what sustainability means. And then the other side was to capture those, what they thought that are in the teaching and learning of environmental education in Ireland. Environmental educators, primary school staff, families, which included parents and children, and what their thoughts are around environmental education in primary schools, but also children's connection with the natural environment in comparison to previous generations, which is quite topical at the moment. So the research process was secondary analysis, of which there's plenty of examples on the board of looking at various data sets and key authors in your area. I also looked at environmental education programs. I didn't look at individual programs to evaluate those programs. I looked at programs that were representative of the sector in Ireland overall and categorised those into state-funded, semi-state and NGO. So for the state-funded, the National Parks and Wildlife Service. So they would be, in terms of structure, they would offer a number of nature awareness programs to primary schools, either outreach, so a practitioner going into a school delivering a particular program, or the school come to visit a national park. So I was in Knocksink Nature Reserve in Enniskerry and Glendalough and also Connemara. The semi-state was the Heritage in Schools scheme, which is slightly different. The National Parks and Wildlife Service can be a one-off visit, and it's free to schools and it's up to the school to sign up to it. The Heritage in Schools scheme is based on a 4 visit, so the 3 visits are paid for by a school and the 4th one will be supported by the Heritage Council. And that's a directory of 160 plus heritage experts in various aspects of Irish heritage. So you could have the built heritage, archaeology, flora, fauna, marine, any other aspect of heritage I can't think of off the top of my head. Cultural, thank you. And the third one for NGO was the Eco Bio, which is run by the Burren Bio Trust in Kinvara in County Galway, and slightly longer than the previous 2. It's over 20 weeks, quite embedded into primary schools, and looks at the landscape of the Burren, so focusing on perhaps maybe aspects of the heritage in school scheme, tutors come into the primary school and teach each child about the history, the archaeology, flora, fauna, marine of the burn. So it's identifying each primary school child with what's just outside the window as best they can. And I suppose from that perspective then, moving on to just in terms of the programs, that is also up to the school to sign on to those programs. It's not mandatory within schools to do it. So as a sector, you are working with the formal education, and you can see the frequency is dependent on the program that's on offer. Environmental educators were 18. They were from countrywide, so I travelled a bit they initially had a short list, and that snowballed. Their experience spanned several decades, from the last 10 years to working in the 70s, 60s and 80s, even further back. And the primary schools, I chose 6 primary schools in the Galway region to use Galway as a representative example, but also an island off the west coast of Galway as a comparative study. And families then were from those schools, so voluntary flyers, follow-up phone calls to get as many families on board to interview them. In terms of the questions I asked, if I divide them into adult and children, the adults, particularly from the environmental educators, what do you deliver? How do you design your program? What do you feel is important in your program when you are with children? How do you think your program differs, or environmental education differs, to how when you were a child? Do you think children experience more environmental education in school than when you did when you were at primary school? Do you think children are disconnected from the natural environment? Is that different to when you were a child? And that's the same with the school staff in terms of their opinions of changes in recent decades in children's contact, but also how is environmental education delivered in primary schools? How do you link it to the curriculum? What barriers or constraints are you up against with the primary curriculum, within the grounds of your school, or the ethos and management dependent? And for the families, the adults, those sets of questions still applied, but also considering their children were in the room, you also got the interpretation or the idea of what they were trying to do to ensure that their children were connected as much as possible with the natural world. And for the children, they were of a primary school age, but different ages. So invariably, when I did ask questions of what you did in primary school that day in terms of a nature program, you get a story-like format. So I got several tours of back gardens and huts and dens, but it was very much in the moment and in the present, and their voices were really key, particularly in research where the learner's voice is often overlooked, particularly in environmental education. So I hope that gives you an overview of the research process. So in looking at a case for Ireland, I was delighted to see with the posters in the room that it is a very broad spectrum when you're looking at people's relationship with the natural environment. And one book, A Sociology of Ireland by Tovey, Corcoran and Scher, found that Irish people have become modern in their attitudes towards the environment, and with that their connection has diminished. So if you look at the Irish landscape in the last 20 to 30 years, it has changed in terms of infrastructure, housing premises, building premises, which has changed how and in what way children can move from A to B, and their mobility has certainly been put into question of their access to areas, irrespective of whether city centre, urban or suburban. And what's interesting from that perspective, actually, if I could just go back a little, from environmental education point of view, there's a considerable momentum looking at the environmental sustainable problems to equip society with the skills and environmental knowledge to prevent further environmental degradation, and constantly focusing on children as the future environmentalists. And with environmental education, it's always important to think about that it's not necessarily that, particularly recent criticisms, that it has failed to halt environmental destruction, environmental education itself, but that there's different approaches to environmental education, and that children interpret environmental education differently, and also they interpret their local environment quite differently, and that it's quite complicated. So yes, there has been a disconnection as modernisation has happened, but there's a number of cultural and social factors that come into play as well in bringing environmental education into the context of a case for Ireland. So, and that's also reflected in a number of studies, this broader spectrum. So maybe some of you have heard of, growing up in Ireland, a longitudinal study, national longitudinal study, where they found that 91% of mothers felt that they would like for their children to play outside, but 42% felt that there wasn't enough safe areas for them to do so. So that could tie into antisocial behaviour or bad lighting in local parks at night. And also with the Children's Independent Mobility Study, which was across 16 countries, parallel studies on children's mobility, and asking children how did they have permission or the autonomy to cross roads, go outside after dark, could they go to their friend's house on their bicycle, could they take the local bus to school. And Ireland came 14th out of 16th, with Norway or Finland number 1, 2, 3 and 4. Finland number 1, yeah. So, and also another study is the Eurobarometer surveys, which reflect public opinion and attitudes in environmental attitudes and behaviours over time. So Eurobarometer surveys are a way of measuring European countries' public opinion on different topics. And for environmental education, I looked at environmental attitudes and behaviours and mapped Irish opinions towards the environment over time. And they don't necessarily point, although in comparison to the 70s or so, when Irish environmental opinions were very much focused on pollution, they're now more on a par with other European citizens in terms of climate change and worries about environmental sustainability. And what these studies show is, the complex story behind children's connection with the natural environment, but they also influence the design, the implementation, and the content of environmental education, because you can see how many factors are pushing and pulling towards different programs, and they also support practitioners on the ground in saying we need to do more of this. So the disconnection hypothesis. One study that stood out to me was Karen Malone in 2008, and she titled her paper "The Bubble Wrap Generation," and she gave 50 Australian suburban children a camera for a week to see what they would take pictures of. And the majority of the pictures were from the backseat of a car. But she didn't say that, focus too much on the disconnection hypothesis. What she kind of aligned it was that we as a society need to help alleviate the fear of parents in leaving their children outside, to create safe spaces for children to be able to go outdoors, and that's part of the problem. This is a symptom of it, but to go broad and keep an eye on society and the role that we have to enable children to roam and create safe spaces for them. One other part of the disconnection hypothesis that could be questioned or looked at a little closer is it's very often focused on the spiritual, biological and genetic bond between humans and the natural environment. So for example, Edward Wilson with the biophilia hypothesis, and that human beings have an innate affiliation to be with other forms of life. And that with modernization, that connection has been broken. However, once outdoors, many of those that would align with the biophilia hypothesis, that once outdoors, that psychological bond or that innate connection will come back. However, it doesn't question to what extent a disconnection actually exists. And it could be argued that it's actually a perception of what a connection ought to be. And it doesn't take into those wider social, cultural avenues or factors that were looked at in the studies, and how that can also play a role. Because as environmental educators, if they are disconnected, to what extent can environmental education make a difference? And also, if you're not looking at the connection that you're seeking to achieve, is environmental education disconnecting children further from the natural environment? So it's about questioning what underpins those things. In terms of concepts of environmental education that emerged from the data, was that two strands of environmental education coexist. Strand one would be very focused on the experiential, hands-on educational approach, child-centred, child-led, looking at the natural environment as a place that we are part of, that we are intrinsically bound with. And strand two would focus more on the rational, didactic, outcome environmental education. So seeing the environmental education as a problem to solve, we must manage its resources. And what I didn't look at was the Green Schools programme. I focused primarily on programmes that were about this hands-on disconnection, reconnect children through being outdoors. But one aspect of the Green Schools programme, of which there are many, is the focus on recycling and reuse and behaviours around energy consumption. And what was interesting about how successful that is, in comparison to the experiential ones, which were very often not fully embedded, 1 visits, 4 visits or 20 weeks, the Green Schools is over years. It's very well suited to the formal education system in terms of outcomes, and the message goes back home in terms of monitoring within the home. So the experiential, unless supported outside the school and within the home, can often be seen as a one-off and not fully integrated into the curriculum unless the teacher is interested. But it's the balance between the two. It's not that one or other, it's that both have a benefit. It's just about how you design and implement them and being aware that that exists within the sector. Primary school curriculum. For the thesis, I looked at 5 primary school curricula that spanned about 140 years. So the British national school system in Ireland dates from 1831. And I know it's quite a complicated timeline, but I thought it was probably the best way to kind of just identify it. In payment by results, so 1872 to 1899, that was a curriculum that was very narrow, focused on the 3 R's, reading, writing and arithmetic. And teachers were given, their fee was based on the good results of their children in their class. It was very classroom based. There wasn't much outdoor at all. And although outdoor environmental education or outdoor learning was encouraged, it wasn't widely practiced. However, with the revised programme in 1900 and 1922, there was an understanding that the previous curriculum was quite narrow and how to improve it. So they were focused, in 1904, they introduced kindergarten for infant classes, to use school grounds for vegetable plots, to go to areas of local natural interests. Having said that, the teachers that were teaching the now new curriculum were taught on the previous curriculum. So they didn't necessarily have the confidence to teach the new curriculum, and there wasn't training available for that. So taught at the teacher's discretion, maybe a one-off school, but it certainly is although I found it timetabled in one primary school curriculum, I couldn't actually find whether it had actually happened widely in practice. Then on becoming a free state in 1921 and 1922, you had the National Programme for Primary Instruction, where elementary science, nature study, rural science and school gardening were marginalised and became optional in 1934, and the focus on building of the Irish state. And what that meant was on becoming a free state, there was the focus on the Irish language, Irish culture and Irish identity and nationalism, and that the previous elementary science and nature study was deemed associated with the ascendancy, the landed gentry, and was not the focus of what the new nation state was going to focus or was going to put into its curriculum and focus on for younger generations. The flip side of that coin is that Ireland had largely escaped the wrath of the Industrial Revolution. The countryside was quite rural, many families were involved in agriculture, and most children were probably walking to school. So there could have been an assumption on the teacher's perspective that they would have been learning about nature studies and elementary science by osmosis, that it was just happening anyway. But it wasn't reinforced in the classroom unless it was at the teacher's discretion and if there was time. For the curriculum Bunscola in the primary school curriculum in 1971, the reason for the reassessment there was Ireland joined the EU, and there was an economic growth in the country, and also to have the education on a par with EU EEC counterparts. And environmental education was brought back in, but spread across a number of curricular areas. Again, you have teachers that were not necessarily trained. The curriculum was brought in quite quickly. They would have been students of the previous curriculum, whereby nature studies may or may not have been taught, so they wouldn't have had a template to follow from their own primary school curriculum. Unless they had an interest, they taught it as their teacher, as a teacher with the new curriculum from the 1970s. So unless a particular school management or there was a garden in the school grounds, invariably it was left to the discretion of a teacher. So again, you can see the status over time of environmental education, very checkered, but also quite low and quite consistently low within a primary school education. And in the reassessment in 1999, environmental education is still across a number of curricular areas. However, there have been calls to deload the primary school curriculum, that it's far too many subject areas for a primary school teacher to teach. And also what I found from the feedback from teachers, students and the environmental educators was that time constraints, curricular pressures, again, unfortunately the status of environmental education can be when they have the time. But then again, that is the value of the outsourced programs to help support and provide confidence to teachers, a very well established sector. It goes back a very long way as a subject area with people that have skills and knowledge that can certainly complement what goes on in the classroom. And I just thought I'd show a couple of pictures of the earlier primary school curricula, in particular for the orange one, that's 1971, so the curriculum of Bunscola. One of the ladies that I interviewed, her father was a primary school teacher, and she says it came in 2 books. So I think environmental education was in SESE in the second book, but she said they got minimal training, and she remember seeing her father just scratch his head going, I want to be able to teach this, but it's very complicated and I've got other subjects that I have to take care of and the needs within my classroom as well. And that it was and it was down to him having an interest for it to be taught and to take the time to go through this, but there was no hands-on training available for teachers when the new curriculum came in. So findings overall, in terms of a connection, I found that environmental education is effective depending on the connection it seeks to achieve between a child and the natural environment. Essentially, the adult interviewees, many of them would refer and say children are absolutely disconnected from the natural environment. They do not have the same space for me to roam as I did when I was a child. And then on the other hand, the children were quite interesting, how they described how they interacted and responded with their natural environment actually showed a connection remained, that it's quite resilient, that it has altered and changed. Their remit has certainly become much smaller, but that it still exists. And that was, for example, with the island study, where the children on the island had quite a large repertoire of bird names, particularly from cliffs, and could roam a long way. You know, everybody kind of looked out for each other. It was quite a small island. And then you look at a housing estate that, although is in the countryside and the school is maybe 400 yards away, the mother doesn't feel safe to cycle her kid to school because the cars are going too fast, because the local authority won't lower the speed limit. So invariably, although they're in the countryside, they are within a very small remit. The stories of how that child played in their back garden and the huts that they made and what they liked and what they enjoyed were quite similar. Smaller in terms of space, but how they emotionally responded and how complex that socialization process is between a child and their natural environment was a real eye-opener. And that they're not passive agents in their back garden or where they're going. They're actually quite observant and they can see things, and that can be part of it as well. And the importance for environmental education to enhance that and not necessarily recreate a particular notion or perception of what a connection ought to be based on previous experiences. Lessons learned from the UK, I thought this could be part of the discussion in terms of going forward. The Bay Trust that I work with in the UK, they have a residential centre. So imagine an old rectory building with a couple of acres, a pond for pond dipping. You have a moot hall, which is a straw bale build with a fire pit in the middle. You have ovens that you can use, woodland areas that you can roam. And kids come there generally it's quite a culture in the UK actually, which I wasn't aware until I went over there, but kids can go for a week. So primary school particularly, inner city London or local countryside from Monday to a Friday. And each day is packed with activities, and we're not too far from Dover, so you go down to the beach, walk, amble down, you do your geography in terms of navigation on the way down. And on the way back then you could have a campfire on the way, and then there's storytelling. And there's quite a link between the benefits of that on children's resilience, perseverance, self-confidence and attainment. So partnership with Canterbury Christchurch University, and I'm social sciences, not education, and we did it with psychology, not education as well, just to see what would come back if we did a longitudinal study with some of the schools that came to Rippledown, which is the name of the centre. So what we found, we also included dietary awareness, because a lot of kids don't sit at a table or make dinners, particularly from the perspective of the students that were coming to Rippledown. And there's an allotment on the ground, and they would all be involved in setting of the table. They would all have tasks. They would all know what they're eating and where it would have come from. And we found that there were positive impacts on their resilience and self-esteem, and that's to do with the openness of the programme that's on offer in terms of the outdoors, but also teamwork challenges, social skills. And somebody mentioned that when you're out of their element, I think Vicky mentioned at the end there, when they're out of their element, suddenly you have to make it work. So the pecking order changes within groups, and teachers notice that as well. And once they see the value of that for children in their development, they can come back next year. But also to make the link with attainment, because, for example, the Learning Away study at the top, which was a national study in the UK over a 7-year period that looked at the benefits of residential experiences for children. And they very much focused on the attainment as well, and that helped justify for a teacher to go to their head to say, I know it is expensive, but here are the results. This is how it will help children in their learning in the classroom, both within a residential context, but also when you come back, and how it can benefit. Yes, it links into their confidence, but also linking it to the curriculum, which gives, similar to the curriculum in Ireland with time constraints, focusing on the benefits and the outcomes of these outdoor learning experiences that make sense to schools to encourage them to come on board a bit more as well. So because of the Learning Away programme or study, there's now a 2-year campaign called Supporting Residentials, of which the company that I work with are part of as well, and trying to feed in more evidence to look at, to build leverage that residentials could be at some point mandatory and as a key learning experience for children within their schooling. And the others, keeping an eye on time, sorry. The other study just below, it's Student Outcomes and National Schooling, was a large conference in London in 2015, trying to gather all of the evidence, not just for residentials, but outdoor learning in general, and the development of toolkits on how to gather this evidence. So there's an awful lot of practitioners in the room, and practitioners are key. So a lot of the language is around practitioner-led research and how everybody can be singing and gathering evidence off the same hymn sheet so you can aggregate it. That is your leverage for policy. That's your leverage going into schools for more funding, as well as justifying your own programme that you're doing. A Natural Connections demonstration project was focused on learning in the natural environment and working with primary schools that got nearly in excess of 40,000 primary and secondary school students outdoors. And again, building that baseline evidence to encourage more students to come on board, but also to value what the sector does provide as well. And I think in summary, I have a small bibliography, but I can easily give any more details on it. But I hope it's given you an overview of environmental education in Ireland, the questioning, the purpose of environmental education and its objectives, and studies of the types of evidence that are being collected, and how this is a huge opportunity as well. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That's been a whistle-stop tour of more than a century and a half of what's gone on in Ireland in terms of curriculum and the outdoors, but I think a very focused attention about children and their connection with nature, and about evidence from the UK which we can use. We might invite some questions for a few minutes, and what Katrina did earlier, if you don't mind, in terms of for our online audience, if you could sort of paraphrase or repeat the question so that the people listening can
Okay.
Is there a difference between environmental education and outdoor learning?
Yeah. Is there a difference between environmental education and outdoor learning? I think ultimately, no. I think there's a lot of changing of titles. So it starts off as nature study, elementary science, and now environmental education is now outdoor learning. I think we could all get a broad understanding of what they are, but that's part of the problem. Defining environmental education or outdoor learning is quite complicated. I can understand it, but nobody seems to also question, which is a very good question, what underpins it. Because this is going a little bit off track, but the term or the word education is very complicated, and so is learning. You might kind of associate nature with one thing and environment with another. I would understand it as the same because I understand the field, but unless that's open to the others as well, how people interpret it.
Back in the 80s to go a lot about outdoor environmental education, and she had the same question and the issue in her writing, and she came to the conclusion that you're much better off focusing on the outcomes of your programme rather than defining these terms, which are kind of catch-all terms. So you've really got a good, very interesting question, but in fact, that terms are really better focused on your own programme and what it can do for people, what we're trying to define those terms.
Thank you.
I think if I could add to that, I think it's a very interesting thing because we've certainly used the term outdoor learning in terms of our degree and the culture in Ireland, and I suppose in terms of public provision of learning in the outdoors, it's traditionally been called outdoor education. But we felt that internationally, looking at other work, that outdoor learning gave a broader term, that it was like an umbrella that more people could seek refuge under. I suppose there's a natural tendency, and particularly among people in the outdoors, to identify how they're different from everybody else, not the same as everybody else. And I think with outdoor learning, there's a challenge to us to try and see if we can all stand under that umbrella and actually see similarities in our practice, whether it's an outdoor practice in youth work, or in mental health, or in community practice, or in education.
Yeah.
And do you know the Leave No Trace programme? I'd see that as a good bridge between, because sometimes at outdoor centres, it's all very, adventure action based, and it's really great to engage people, but the Leave No Trace kind of brings in that, thinking what is our effect when we're walking through towards our, when we all offload here or when we drive in places, so that's a good,
it's not.
I don't know if that's part of this.
No, we're certainly both engaged with Leave No Trace Ireland in various capacities. But I think I like Leave No Trace in that sense because it's not intimidating either. It's not what you can't do. It's just about how about try it this way, and that means that it's much more inclusive in its tone. You don't want to be told you can't do something outdoors. It just kind of, you want to enjoy it. And I think how they explain the reasons behind, particularly with camping, as we did in January, which was challenging, yeah. But it opened a whole other world because I was suddenly with people that do camping all the time, and they were sharing tricks of the trade. But it was never like you shouldn't do that. If you're with a group, you should be showing them this way. It was more inclusive. So yes, Leave No Trace is very good that way. Yeah. Accessible. Yeah.
Well, Sarah's not going anywhere, and we have some workshops which the students have developed based on the content